Greetings everyone, welcome to Games Done Justice. Today's subject is Odallus the Dark Call, a crowdfunded game developed and released by Joymasher. You can find it on sites like Humble Bundle, Good Old Games, and Steam, where I've heard it called the best game on Steam that no one is talking about, which naturally makes it ideal for this show. Odallus is an adventure platformer that for the most part plays like a classic Castlevania title, with some very lightly sprinkled Metroidvania elements reminiscent of Demon's Crest. There are even alternate skins I don't have that let you play as a Belmont or Firebrand, so that's cool. It also takes some cues from Ninja Gaiden in the cutscenes, and the art-style, enemy design, and especially the bosses appear to be inspired by Berserk. But the designs are kept appropriately simpler for an 8-bit game where you'll only be able to squeeze in so many details. You play as this Braveheart-looking grump named Haggis, whose many battles have left him jaded and unable to connect with people, even his own son. When his son is kidnapped and their village Glenfinnan is burned down by the evil Lord Gale, Haggis comes alive for the first time in years and all hell breaks loose. It's cheesy and simple, and yeah, toxic ideas about malehood and whatnot. The deep inner turmoil of Haggis on this bloody journey takes a backseat for me, but the world of Odallus is fascinating in its darkness. I'll get to what I really mean after I talk about the gameplay. First, I feel I should mention that despite appearances, this isn't actually an emulated NES game. This will be obvious to some of you judging from the width of the screen and maybe a few other little things that give it away, but it wouldn't surprise me if at least some people fell for these graphics and wondered what decade this is from. But make no mistake, it's not a product from the 80s or an upscaled leftover released in the early 90s. No, this game was released in 2015. So it's another one of these retro games we've seen a lot of in recent years, which I know some people are getting tired of, but I think this is one of the more sincere attempts at making an old-style game work in the current era. There's a couple of different display modes. While I had trouble recording footage of it, I like to go with TV mode, which bubbles the edges of the screen to mimic the shape of a CRT, adds some scan lines that are barely noticeable, and has a slightly more limited range of colors, since some of these don't exist on the NES. That said, I think they could go a step further. One of the coolest things about playing old school games on an old TV is how edges are affected. You look at Link or Mario on today's screens and they're a blocky, janky mess made of giant squares. But on the screens these games were made for, those blocks were nicely rounded out, if a little fuzzy. There are many different CRTs, and they don't all have quite this effect I'm describing, but depending on the screen you could have a tiny cartoon character jumping around. But of course a lot of new problems are created by these screens that have since been fixed. That said, if they're going to go through the trouble of recreating scan lines, one of the more annoying things about those screens, I wish the developers of games like this would go all the way and create a filter that simulates that rounded fuzzy look that makes these giant pixels less blocky. I know that would be difficult, and they may end up making a game that isn't remotely close to being 8-bit at all, and uses tiny pixels to create that blurriness. It would just be a cool way to complete the illusion. Even without that, Odallus feels pretty authentic, especially in the sound department. Everything has this nice crunch or twang to it. And there are even some voice clips that they compressed with hilarious results. And despite the intentional graphical limitations, Odallus has a surprisingly strong presentation. Dare I say the use of colors fills the scenery with life to great effect, and the game is enchanting for its bleakness and simplicity. When you only have so many pixels and colors at your disposal, just finding unique ways to use those assets can go a long way. Some people might find the game ugly, and I don't really blame them, but I think it's beautiful. Controlling Haggis is interesting. You begin the game with nothing but his sword, his basic moveset, and whatever pickups you find in the village, things like torches and axes, or soups and meats that restore your health. One thing that's a little annoying about this merchant is he charges just a little more each time you buy an item from him, but he does stop raising his prices eventually, so it's not like you'll ever have to pay 9,999 orbs to him for a bowl of soup. And these orbs are usually dropped by enemies, but can also be found in greater quantities in chests behind walls or on ledges, encouraging you to explore wherever you can. Haggis isn't very fast or strong, and his jump isn't that high. The early areas are of course built to accommodate his fairly limited mobility, so I wouldn't blame anybody for getting the impression that Haggis's mobility would stay this way, that it's just a clunky game. But then you get items like Fenrir's Ring, which gives you the ability to dash, and then you get the Harpy Boots, which are your double jump, and then you can use both of them at the same time to jump further. And if you combine these abilities with Pazuzu's Cape, which summons a monster that gently carries Haggis through the air, you get some crazy distance. So we started with a fittingly sluggish 8-bit character that eventually evolves to control like a character in a 16-bit or even 32-bit game. It's like if you started a game as classic Mega Man without his charge shot or slide ability, then halfway through you're playing a next game with armor upgrades and everything. Even some of the bosses felt like they think they're in a Zero or ZX game. Some of the things Haggis does would have been tough to get working so smoothly in a true 8-bit game, though maybe not impossible. But they do end up making Odallus more fun than it'd be without these touches. The game does make updates and improvements to this formula. The stage select is a good example of this. The first 4 areas in the top row each have a second exit, leading to one of the 4 areas in the bottom row. The top row is connected by one continuing thread, but each of the bottom 4 areas can only be accessed from the area directly above it. They aren't connected to each other, they're more like tree branches, each going their own way and stopping. So if you leave Area 1 of the Dark Forest through the second exit, which leads to Area 2, then you beat Area 2 of the Dark Forest, you won't then proceed to Area 2 of the Aqueducts, like if this were Star Fox. You won't even be taken to Area 1 of the Aqueducts. You'll have to go back and beat Area 1 of the Dark Forest, going through the normal exit to continue along that upper thread. Now this might sound bad, but the way they do it is pretty smart. Backtracking is almost always a thing in these types of games, and it can be a big pain if going through a level over and over again just isn't your thing. One of the nice things about Odallus, which I'm surprised not that many other games do, is you don't have to start from the beginning of an area upon re-entering it. If you've left through a secret exit, you'll be given an option to start from there, so you won't be far off the beaten path, and you might not even be that far away from the normal exit. Cutting back to an exit like this can save you a lot of time, especially if you remember the location of a nearby ledge or a breakable wall you couldn't reach before or some obstacle you just got the power-up for in another area. As you continue to upgrade Haggis' mobility, even plowing through an entire stage over again to pick up whatever you may have missed before becomes hardly any trouble. And it's not one of those games where if you accidentally jump into a stage you didn't want to, you're stuck there and have to waste all your life to get back to the world map. You can just walk to the left and leave. So even the beginning of each area is technically also an exit. With a few upgrades you can work your way backwards through most of these stages. That is a legitimate way to play this game. Also, since the areas in the second row tend to be longer and more difficult and don't have secret exits leading to anywhere else, it's nice that they threw in these elevators as a means of fast travel. You just need to make it to one halfway through a stage to activate the one at the start. As much as I love Demon's Crest, and it is one of my favorite games, the way exits at alternate areas, these levels within levels, are handled in Odallus is an improvement in my eyes. On a side note, I like how if large objects fall in Haggis, they don't kill him, they just sort of poop him out. It's also pretty open-ended when it comes to collecting items. You can get an item that lets you breathe underwater well before you go to the main water level, making it easier, when many similar games would force you through at least some of the water stage unprotected before getting a power-up like that. You might nab the most powerful blade in the game before coming across the second most powerful blade. There are areas you can't reach without this or that power, but you can make it all the way to Gale's castle without most of them. But you'll need to beat all 8 areas to enter the castle. Each area has a boss at the end in possession of an Odallus shard. Collect all 8 shards and a barrier opens as they fuse together. The bosses have just the right sort of pace for me. Some of them might seem hard, but oftentimes you'll find you may have only been 2 or 3 slashes away from beating them before they knocked out your last heart. And they're fun enough anyways that most of them never get that frustrating. And depending on the order you go through these levels, you can make them downright easy. Also, each second area has a sub-boss halfway through. Bring him on, I say. On my last playthrough, I encountered a helpful bug where I had to pause the game for a moment to answer the door. Somehow the fight continued while the game was paused, and I don't think Haggis moved for that entire time, but the monster kept attacking, yet I didn't get hit. Meanwhile, the axe I'd thrown at its face stayed there and continuously damaged him until he died. I unpaused the game and the boss was gone. Thank you? As for other collectibles, there are 8 heart pieces to collect, which each had half a unit to your health, and 8 backpack expansions that each had 5 spaces to your total weapon count, going up from 10 to 50. There are also these tablets that don't really give you anything, but they're still counted as secrets you'll need to find for the best ending. They tell you a bit about the world's history. Optionally, you can also talk to the merchant to get hints or learn a little more about why the world of Odallus is quite literally a moody place. Basically, the gods who created this world were in a really foul mood when they did it. So naturally, it ended up being a terrible place that reflected what sourpusses they are. The human mortals of this realm, called the Sedluk, appease the old gods for a time with sacrifices, blood rituals, wars in their name and the like, keeping the darkness that surround them at bay. But the old gods grew so bored with their creations that they stopped answering the Sedlic's calls and moved on to some other dimension to trip out together or whatever old gods do. So now this already crappy world has only grown even worse over time, now completely overrun by bandits and mutants and demons calling themselves the new gods, with the surviving Sedlic completely at their mercy. To hammer this desperation home, I want to touch upon the music, and good lord is it beautiful. I love how they're able to create the feeling of an organ playing in some of these tunes. But even instrumentation aside, these are just good melodies, simple but easy to remember for it, and the shifts from morose as can be to downright epic. This is a bleak world to be sure, but the justification for its state being that the gods who created it were just having a really bad day when they made it, like if you want to build your own Lego creation from a bucket of spare pieces but you're so stressed and frustrated going into it that you just can't get it to look how you want, is a cool and direct twist that I haven't seen used many times before. Haggis remarks at the end of the game that it's been days since the game started, but no matter where we go, we never once see the sun. It's always night, and there are so many monsters everywhere craving the power of the Odallus, it really feels like this world may just be too far gone to save. All you can do is defeat Lord Gale and find your boy. But you actually confront Lord Gale pretty early in the game, so who's leading the new gods in his stead the other 60-something% of the game? Enough of that. Back to collectibles. There's the golem armlets that give you super strength, there's the combat armor which doubles your defense, and the dark armor which gives you other supernatural powers. Interestingly, the dark armor isn't counted by the game as a secret. You'll need this to finish the game 100%, but the game doesn't tell you where to go looking for it or even that you need it, so it's really easy to miss this one. I did on my first run thinking I'd completed the game. You need to find 3 secret rooms with a mark of a ghostly warrior who offers you a prize. The third time you meet him, he challenges you to a duel. He moves just like Haggis does, which will either make this fight super hard or super easy depending on how well you know Haggis by then. Defeat him and he gives you the dark armor. Wearing this, you can sacrifice 10 of your extra weapons to cast a spell. So if you've collected all those backpack expansions, you can do each attack 5 times before having to restock. You can cast 15 spells in one go. Torches will let you create a fiery shield that makes you impervious to basically everything and hits your enemies with reverse contact damage. Sacrificing spears will summon beams of light from above the screen, and you can use axes to charge ahead, plowing through everything like a truck. The final area, Gale's Castle, is pretty short, but the enemies put up a good fight, giving you just enough orbs to restock before entering the boss room. A little ways in, the path splits and we get a nifty, not quite boss rush where you fight two of the game's more prominent villains again with new faces and attacks, and they each get their own portion of the level leading up to them. If you get a game over after this, you won't have to fight them again, and you can just skip to the final boss, the true leader of these new gods. I'm not going to spoil the big twist about who this guy is, even though some of you may have already guessed. It is pretty interesting and tragic. This three-phase fight is great. The challenge is just right, says the guy who died close to 100 times on his first playthrough. The first phase is slow and tense. The guy just waits for you to come swinging at him like an idiot, holding his helmet and using one hand to fight like it's barely worth the energy. You can try getting him from behind, jump around like a fool as much as you like, but it's not going to work. It's a little like the fight with a ghost, which should give you some preparation for this, but you have a much smaller window of opportunity to strike. The trick is to wait for him to lose his patience and finally take a swing at you. Then you have like half a second to jump in and hit him, and then you have to back off. You never know how many times it's gonna be, if he'll just swing once, twice, or thrice, and sometimes he'll just skip to that last swing and swat you across the room, and he hits hard. Like if you didn't collect any extra hearts or armor, he'll kill you with 2 or 3 swipes. You have to be so careful. After a few hits from you, he starts going at it for real, blasting various forms of energy around the room. But in doing so, he leaves himself more open to your attacks. So I'd say this phase is a little easier and more fun. That said, as brutal as those first 2 phases are, if you have the dark armor, the fight becomes a joke. Use the fire attack to break through his defenses in the first fight, and use the beam attack to finish him in the second phase as he just stands or floats around a lot. Desperate, he calls upon the power of the Odallus and transforms into a terrifying yet strangely beautiful small G god demon thing, trapping you in a hellscape made of wall faces, a giant pillar made of phalluses with people helplessly strung up there for eternity, and rabid mouth platforms that mindlessly chomp at the air like they're waiting for something to walk by or fall into them. This imagery is actually pretty tame. We should count ourselves lucky this didn't end with us fighting a giant monster fetus inside a huge alien womb or something. This third phase isn't too hard, but if you don't have more than a few hearts left after those other 2 fights and some armor protection, it can be a pain. And that's right, failing here resets the whole fight. Luckily his new attacks are the kind that cover a lot of the screen but are slow and telegraphed well enough that you can easily outmaneuver it most of the time. The monster itself is invincible. You cannot harm his body directly, but you can disrupt his connection to the completed Odallus orbiting around him with enough thwacks to it. If you've ever been in Battle Network 5, this should be familiar territory. Once his connection to the Odallus is severed, he's unable to sustain this form and he dies from his injuries. Again, I'm not going to give away everything about this ending, but I will show you a little of what happens if you 100% the game, dark armor and all. Forced to absorb the full power of the Odallus, Haggis is nearly driven to madness, but decides the Sedlic are better off without the old or new gods ruling over them, and don't need him to become yet another terror like them. He whisks himself from the Odallus away to another plane, destroying the castle. He later wakes up in an eldritch world with a black sun and huge alien structures. This place is too cool. Like, look at the ground! It's weirdly mechanical like the space jockey ship from Alien. We're not in a medieval fantasy setting anymore, and we may have just crossed over to science fantasy. To be continued? Question mark? Odallus is an awesome adventure that feels complete by the end of it, but there are still places it could go. I'd love to see an Odallus 2 where Haggis confronts the old gods in this other world they fled to. What powerful new terrors may reside here to devour this man-turned-demigod? And as much as I love the 8-bit style of this game, I wouldn't even mind if they changed up the graphics or mechanics to feel like a 16-bit or 32-bit game if that's the direction the developers think would be best. And even if there never is an Odallus sequel, the first game is satisfactory enough to stay on its own. It's a meaty game for a 2D platformer with 9 levels, but doesn't go on for too long either. My first run took me over 6 hours to complete. My second playthrough was just under 4 hours, and I knew what I was doing for the most part that time. But the run I recorded for this review ended up being 2.5 hours. Dang. I don't know what came over me that time. The gameplay is challenging, but reasonable. I wouldn't exactly call it hard, it's almost up there, but if you go out of your way a little bit to find all the goodies, it's perfectly manageable. I love how the levels are constructed and arranged, all these little spots where you can't help but notice something is off, and go about finding a way to exploit it. It takes old ideas and tweaks them to work better than they ever did, even in their time. So yeah, good game. I like the world it creates, I love the presentation in general, and the gameplay is tight but not unfair by any stretch. It's a steal for $10. And if you enjoy this game and are interested in checking out Joymasher's other work, they've also released Oniken, which is to games like Strider and Ninja Gaiden what this game is to Castlevania and Gargoyle's Quest. So if that's another void you're looking to fill, you can get both games together for $13. And that's it for today. My next review will be Sonic Mania. Please share this video with anyone you know who likes these kind of games. And check out my books if you can. That project is more important to me than anything I do here. So if you really want to support me, that's one way to do it. Toodles!